July 1839, off the coast of Cuba. In the silence of night, Joseph Cinqué slipped a hidden blade across iron shackles. Moments later, blood-stained, the deck captors fell, chains broke. The Amistad no longer sailed under tyranny, but under the flag of freedom. Long before his name echoed across American courtrooms, Joseph Cinqué was simply Cinqué Pia, a farmer of the Mende people in Sierra Leone. His life was bound to the rhythm of the soil. He rose with the sun, tilled the fields, planted rice, and tended to his family. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and palm oil, the sound of drums and songs shaping the cycles of his days. Freedom, to him, was not an abstract principle, it was the air he breathed, the right to work, to walk, to live among his kin. That freedom ended in an instant. In the chaos of the coastal forests, raiders armed with muskets and chains swept through villages. Cinqué was seized, bound, and dragged toward the coast like countless others. In those terrifying hours, he was transformed from a man with a family and a farm into a captive commodity. At the coast, he saw the hulking silhouette of the slave ship Tecora, a vessel designed not for travel, but for torment. Inside its hold, hundreds of Africans were crammed together, chained wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle. The stench of sweat, blood, and sickness filled the air. Days blended into nights as bodies pressed against one another in suffocating darkness. Every few hours, the cries of the dying were answered by the splash of the sea, as the crew threw corpses overboard like discarded cargo. Cinqué Pia endured what many could not, the horror of the Middle Passage. Disease spread unchecked. Whips tore open backs for the smallest signs of resistance. The ship was a floating tomb, a machine that turned living men and women into profit. Yet even in that abyss, Cinqué's spirit refused to be extinguished. He watched, he waited, he remembered who he was. By the time the Tecora reached Havana, fewer than had boarded survived. Cinqué was alive, but barely. Torn from his land, his family, his identity, he stood at the slave market with 52 others, displayed under the tropical sun like animals for sale. Traders spoke in Spanish, counting coins over their heads. In their eyes, he was not Cinqué. The farmer, he was inventory, a number on a ledger. But deep inside, beneath the bruises and chains, he carried the memory of home. That ember of dignity, buried under humiliation, would soon ignite. In Havana, the machinery of slavery turned with ruthless precision. The port city was a hub where human lives flowed in like contraband. Spain had officially outlawed the transatlantic trade, but in practice, Havana thrived on its shadow economy. Plantation owners needed hands for their endless cane fields, and smugglers provided them. Cinqué was among 53 Africans purchased by two Spanish planters, José Ruiz and Pedro Montes. Their intent was simple: ship this cargo eastward aboard a small schooner called La Amistad, and from there, march them into the cane fields of Puerto Príncipe. To Ruiz and Montes, it was routine business. To the Africans below deck, it was a death sentence. Cinqué and his companions were shackled in the dark belly of the Amistad. Iron bit into their wrists and ankles, leaving raw wounds that never had time to heal. Chains rattled with the roll of the ship, each sound a reminder of captivity. They were fed meager rations of water and stale bread, barely enough to sustain life, but just enough to keep them alive for labor. Above them, they heard the laughter of sailors, the crack of the whip, the barking of orders in a foreign tongue. Here, Cinqué Pia understood a brutal truth. The voyage across the ocean had not been the end of his nightmare, but the beginning of another. The cane fields of Cuba were graveyards for the living. Those who survived disease and exhaustion were broken by years of toil. His fate, if he accepted it, was to vanish into that system, nameless and forgotten, his body bent under sun and lash until death released him. But he did not accept it. In whispers passed along the hold, he spoke to others. His words carried conviction. We are not slaves, we are men, we can fight. His eyes, once dulled by chains, began to burn with resolve. The schooner creaked through the Caribbean night, heading eastward. Above deck, sailors slept soundly, unaware that below, in the suffocating dark, a plan was forming. Every rattle of chain was no longer despair but a rehearsal. Every whispered word was a spark. Cinqué did not yet know the moment would come so soon, but he knew this. If he bent his neck to the fields, he would lose everything. If he rose, even against impossible odds, he might reclaim a piece of freedom. And so, in the shadows of Havana's betrayal, the seeds of rebellion took root. The days at sea stretched like a punishment without end. Shackled in the darkness of the Amistad's hold, Cinqué felt every sway of the schooner as if it mocked his captivity. Around him, the air was thick with sweat and rust, punctuated by the sound of coughing and the rattle of chains. But within that suffocating gloom, something began to stir, a whisper of resistance. It started with glances exchanged in silence. The Africans aboard were from different villages, speaking varied dialects, but the shared language of suffering drew them together. Cinqué became the center of this fragile web. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. He spoke of Sierra Leone, of the soil beneath his feet, of how they were men, not beasts, to be driven like cattle. Hope needed more than words, it needed a weapon. One day, during the careless movements of a sailor, a small piece of iron, a nail or spike found its way into the hands of the captives. It was passed from one calloused palm to another until it reached Cinqué. In that moment, it ceased being a scrap of metal, it became a key. By night, hidden beneath the rough planks of the ship, Cinqué pressed it into shackles, testing its strength. Each twist echoed like a promise. Iron could be broken. Chains could be undone. When he lifted his wrists and felt the brief release of metal, he saw not just freedom, but vengeance. Still, there was danger in every breath. The Spaniards carried knives and muskets. The crew was armed and alert. If the plot was discovered too soon, their punishment would be swift and merciless. Yet Cinqué's resolve only deepened. He reminded his companions of what awaited in Cuba: endless rows of sugarcane, blistering heat, whips slicing flesh. Death was certain there, he argued, but on the Amistad, freedom still flickered like a distant star. Each day, the plan grew clearer. One man would distract, another would strike. The iron spike would unlock the first set of chains, and once the shackles fell, they would turn the very tools of their bondage into weapons. Fear was natural, but Cinqué's calm presence steadied the trembling hearts. Above them, sailors laughed. Below, in shadows and whispers, history prepared to change course. The 1st of July, 1839. The sea was calm, but the air below deck was charged, as though the ship itself sensed what was about to unfold. Cinqué's hand gripped the crude iron spike. The time for whispers had ended. Tonight, chains would break, or men would die trying. One by one, he freed his wrists, then moved silently from man to man, releasing their shackles. The sound of iron slipping free was almost sacred, like the tolling of bells. Faces once dulled by despair lit up with raw determination. They were no longer captives, they were soldiers. Armed with sugarcane machetes stolen from the cargo, they ascended the ladder. The hatch creaked open, and the night air rushed in, cool and electric. For a heartbeat, the deck was silent. Then the storm erupted. The Spaniards, caught in their sleep, woke to chaos. Cinqué led the charge, striking with fury born from months of pain. Steel met flesh in flashes of moonlight. Ramon Ferrer, the captain of the Amistad, fell beneath their blades. His authority dissolved in blood. The crew scrambled, shouts in Spanish colliding with cries in Mende. But the Africans fought like men possessed. Every blow was a declaration. We are not property, we are free. Some sailors managed to resist, but terror overtook them. In the frenzy, bodies tumbled into the dark sea, swallowed whole. By dawn, the deck was slick, littered with broken wood, spilled cargo, and the silence of the defeated. Cinqué stood at the helm, chest heaving, machete in hand, his eyes reflecting both triumph and grief. Freedom had been seized, but at a cost measured in blood. Only 2 Spaniards remained alive, José Ruiz and Pedro Montes. Cinqué spared them, but not out of mercy. He needed their knowledge of navigation. He commanded them to steer the ship east, toward Africa, toward home. With every order, he asserted a truth no one could ignore. The Amistad was no longer a vessel of slavery, it was a ship of rebellion. Yet even as the first rays of sun lit the bloody deck, a question lingered in the salt air. Could this fragile freedom survive the ocean ahead? The deck of the Amistad smelled of salt, sweat, and blood. In the silence after the revolt, Cinqué looked out across the endless horizon. For the first time since his capture, the chains were gone. The schooner was theirs, yet freedom on the open sea was fragile, more illusion than certainty. José Ruiz and Pedro Montes, the 2 surviving Spaniards, cowered at sword's edge. Cinqué spared them, but his decision was not pity, it was strategy. None of the Mende knew how to navigate. Without sailors, they were free men, adrift in a prison without walls. So he ordered the Spaniards to steer east, back toward the African coast. By day, the schooner cut eastward. By night, however, the Spaniards secretly turned the rudder north and west, guiding the vessel toward American shores. It became a silent contest of wills, played out against the rolling sea. Below deck, the Africans tended their wounds and buried their dead at sea, singing laments that rose above the waves. Each splash of a body overboard was a reminder victory had not come without loss. Yet Cinqué enforced order with iron discipline. He would not let the ship dissolve into chaos. Food and water were rationed, guards were posted, and the Spaniards were watched closely. Days turned into weeks. The sun burned their backs by day, and storms lashed the deck by night. Every morning, Cinqué stood tall, his voice steady as he told the others, "We are not slaves, we are free men, and free men return home." Those words kept despair at bay. Still, doubts lingered. The horizon never changed. The Spaniards' treachery became obvious. Each night's course undid the day's journey. Yet Cinqué pressed forward. He was not only their leader, he was their anchor. The Amistad, once a symbol of bondage, had become a floating republic of resistance, its battered sails carrying the weight of hope. But freedom at sea was fragile, and the ocean had no mercy. Ahead lay hunger, thirst, and a rendezvous with forces they could not yet see. As weeks stretched into months, survival became its own war. The barrels of water grew lighter, the stores of food dwindled to scraps. Men and women chewed on tough, stale biscuits and fought over drops of brackish water. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, but worse was the thirst. Tongues cracked, lips bled, and each sunrise was torture. Some began to collapse where they sat, their bodies unable to endure the slow starvation. Cinqué carried the weight of their suffering on his shoulders. He enforced fairness in rations, but fairness did not fill empty stomachs. When death came, it was quiet, eyes dimming, breath slowing, then silence. The survivors laid their companions to rest in the sea, singing soft chants as the waves swallowed them. Each burial was both mourning and defiance, a reminder that they were human beings, not cargo. Tension simmered between the Africans and the two Spaniards. The captives suspected the trickery of their supposed navigators. They saw the coastline shift, not east toward Africa, but northward. Cinqué confronted Ruiz and Montes, machete flashing in the dim light, demanding honesty. The Spaniards swore obedience, but their eyes betrayed fear. Trust was impossible, yet Cinqué knew killing them meant drifting blind into the Atlantic's void. Through storms, starvation, and treachery, Cinqué's leadership became unshakable. He stood at the bow, wind tearing at his clothes, declaring to the sea, "We will not die as slaves. If we die free." His words lit a fire in their exhausted hearts. For more than 2 months, the Amistad lurched between hope and despair. By day, it drifted under a scorching sun, its sails tattered. By night, stars glittered above men who whispered of home, of wives, of children left behind. The schooner had become less a ship than a symbol, a fragile vessel of defiance in a world built on chains. And then, one morning, land rose on the horizon, not Africa, but the distant shore of America. Their odyssey was about to collide with a new empire, one where freedom and slavery were locked in their own violent struggle. August 1839. After more than 2 months adrift, the battered schooner limped along the waters off Long Island, New York. Its sails hung in tatters, its decks scarred by blood, hunger, and storms. To the fishermen along the coast, the Amistad looked like a ghost ship, but to the U.S. Navy, it was prey. The brig Washington intercepted the vessel. American sailors boarded, their muskets gleaming in the morning sunday. What they found shocked them. A ragged band of Africans, gaunt from starvation, their eyes burning with determination. At their center stood Cinqué, machete in hand, defiant even in exhaustion. But defiance could not stop the tide of empire. Cinqué and his companions were seized, bound once more in irons, and led ashore. The Spaniards, Ruiz and Montes, immediately claimed ownership, declaring these men were their property rebellious slaves who had murdered their lawful master. To American authorities, it was a puzzle tangled with politics, law, and international treaties. Dragged to a jail in New Haven, Connecticut, the Africans awaited their fate. The cell walls were cold, but nothing was colder than the realization that chains had returned. They had tasted freedom on the open sea only to find themselves captives once again, this time not of smugglers, but of the American legal system. News spread quickly. The Amistad case became a national sensation. Pro-slavery voices demanded swift punishment, murderers must hang, and property must be restored. Spain pressed its claim, insisting that the Africans be returned under international law. Yet in abolitionist circles, whispers grew into cries. These men were not slaves, they were free people kidnapped from Africa. Behind the bars, Cinqué rallied his companions. He prayed, he spoke, he reminded them of why they fought. "We did not steal ourselves," he said. "We were stolen." His words cut through despair like fire in the night. In America, their chains were not just iron, they were political. Their struggle was about to move from the deck of a ship to the floor of a courtroom. And in that courtroom, the fate of freedom itself would be put on trial. The case of United States versus the Amistad opened in a Connecticut courtroom, but it felt larger than any trial before it. The benches overflowed with lawyers, reporters, and curious citizens. At stake was more than the lives of 53 Africans. It was the very definition of freedom. The Spanish crown demanded their return as runaway slaves. Ruiz and Montes testified, painting the rebels as violent criminals who had butchered their rightful master. Government lawyers echoed the claim, warning that to free the captives would defy treaties and disrupt relations with Spain. The logic was cold. Property had rebelled, and property must be restored. But abolitionists saw a different truth. Louis Tappan, a prominent activist, organized support. Missionaries brought interpreters who could speak Mende, giving Cinqué and the others a voice in court. Slowly, their story unfolded. The kidnapping in Sierra Leone, the horror aboard the Ticora, the sale in Havana, the chains on the Amistad. They were not runaways, they were stolen men fighting for their lives. The turning point came when Cinqué himself stood before the judge. In halting English, he declared, "Make us free." Those 3 words cut through the legal jargon, reaching beyond the courtroom to the conscience of a nation. Observers whispered that never before had freedom been claimed with such raw clarity. The case wound its way upward, tangled in appeals and politics, until it reached the highest chamber in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. There, in 1841, the Africans' fate rested in the hands of 9 justices. Their defense found an unexpected champion, John Quincy Adams, the aging former president. At 73, frail but sharp, he stood before the court for 4 hours. He invoked not just law but morality, reminding the justices of America's founding creed that all men are created equal. His words thundered with the weight of history. If the nation could not recognize these men as free, then it betrayed its very soul. The courtroom held its breath. The Amistad rebels, once voiceless, now stood at the center of America's fiercest debate. Freedom or chains? The verdict would decide not only their fate, but the moral direction of a divided nation. The Supreme Court chamber in Washington was hushed, its high ceilings echoing with centuries of law. At the front sat 9 justices, robed in black, their faces solemn. Before them stood Joseph Cinqué, not as cargo, not as a criminal, but as a man demanding to be heard. He rose slowly, his presence commanding even in silence. Through an interpreter, his words rang out with clarity. "Give us free." The phrase was simple, but it struck like thunder. Those 3 words shattered the distance between law books and human lives. No treaties, no arguments, no property claims could erase the truth. Men had been stolen, and men had fought to reclaim what was theirs. Observers described the moment as electric. Some wept openly, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cinqué's plea forced America to face itself. Was this a land that honored liberty, or one that enshrined chains? John Quincy Adams followed, delivering a closing argument that blended law with moral fire. For hours, he thundered against the stain of slavery, invoking the Declaration of Independence, the right of self-defense, and the duty of justice. He reminded the court that these men had not broken laws, they had broken chains. When the verdict came, it echoed like a cannon shot across the nation. By a 7-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the Amistad Africans were not slaves, but free men illegally kidnapped. They had every right to resist, every right to fight, every right to seek liberty. In the courtroom, joy erupted. Cinqué and his companions embraced, tears cutting through months of despair. Outside, Abolitionists hailed the ruling as a victory for justice, a spark in the dark struggle against slavery. Yet the battle was not over. Pro-slavery voices seethed, fearing the precedent it set. For a brief moment, the United States had acknowledged the humanity of the enslaved, but the nation itself remained shackled to the institution. For Cinqué, however, this was vindication. His cry, "Give us free," had become more than words. It had become a verdict, a legacy, a wound cut into the conscience of America. In 1842, Cinqué returned to Sierra Leone. The land of his birth welcomed him back, though the scars of captivity lingered. He had set foot on American soil as a prisoner, but left as a symbol of resistance. His story traveled farther than the Amistad itself, echoing through abolitionist halls, whispered in sermons, and etched in history books. The Amistad Rebellion had lasted barely 2 months at sea, yet its ripples spread across oceans and decades. It proved that chains could be broken, that even in the heart of darkness, men could rise and demand freedom. Cinqué had shown the world that the human spirit could not be reduced to cargo, ledger lines, or property claims. But the world around him changed slowly. Slavery persisted in America for more than 2 decades after his triumph. The sugar fields, the whips, the ships like the Ticora kept running, their shadows long and cruel. Cinqué's victory was not the end of suffering, but it was a spark, and sparks can set fire to empires. Today, when his name is remembered, it is less for the machete he carried and more for the words he spoke. Give us free, a plea, a command, a truth that cannot be forgotten. The Amistad was more than a ship. For 2 months, it was a floating republic of defiance. For centuries, it has remained a symbol of what happens when ordinary men, even in chains, decide they will no longer bow.